soon thereafter the event. And I'm going to be representing GEER here, as well as the Middle Eastern Technical University, who we've partnered with on doing these reconnaissance efforts. And all this work is funded by NSF and NEHR. And so first, just a little bit about GEER. The objective of GEER is to collect perishable data so that we can learn the most from earthquakes, and we don't have to have a repeat cycle of making dumb engineering mistakes. And when I say perishable, I'm talking about data that will go away within a month or 2 months after event. So there's a rescue and recovery period that happens within a couple of weeks of a disaster. And then reconstruction starts within a few weeks to a month. And that reconstruction can often remove or obliterate the data that is useful for geotechnical knowledge, particularly the data that we use for building into our forecasting models for fault rupture, liquefaction, foundation performance, slope instabilities, and others. My role, which has been my role on several events for GEER, is to get in early, right after primary rescue, and get an assessment of the big picture. So try to wrap our arms around the problems that we're going to need to focus on. And then while I'm there, I report out quickly and start helping assemble subsequent teams that are going to then drill down and collect the perishable data. And then also disseminate this information quickly to communities that are interested. And so this is one of our roles of GEER, is disseminating this information. And as was mentioned in the intro, I have a fair amount of experience doing this, working on a slew of earthquakes. So let's jump right in. I'm going to review some stuff that you probably already know, but I want to go through it just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Where our events occurred on February 6th are right near a triple junction. So we have the Anatolian block that's essentially getting squeezed, and it results in some left lateral plate motion there at that boundary. And we use aftershocks to really give a sense for the planes in which the rupture occurred. So there was a precursor event in 2020. It was a 6.7 up north. You can see the green circles there showing the event and the aftershocks. And then we get into the main event, which was, it was really two events. There was the 7.8, which you see in orange. And then there was 9 hours later, the 7.5. And also I'm showing historical seismicity. This is traditionally a very seismic region, similar to the Northern Anatolian Fault, the Eastern Anatolian Fault, although it doesn't run through Istanbul, runs through a fairly populous area and is known to rupture frequently. This was some nice imaging, and I'm going to show an animation of this in just a second. But like earthquakes that we experience, they tend to be very complex events. We like to represent them as linear features, but here we had the initiation started on a small fault. It propagated on to the main Eastern Anatolian Fault. That was a bilateral rupture in both directions. And then that stressed the northern and southern regions, Coulomb stress type model. And then the northern region responded with another rupture on separate Surgu and the Charmak faults. And that was also bilateral, meaning it was started in the middle and propagated out to either end. Here I'm going to show an animation of this to get a sense for the timing. So that was the initiation. There's the bilateral main event, the 7.8. And then 9 hours later, bilateral on the Surgu and Chamak faults. I didn't do this animation. This was some colleagues that have been working on this, and I thought it was really nice visual. The bilateral nature of this rupture, particularly on the main event, has led to some directivity effects, and that's coming out of the ground motions that we're seeing. looking at it from a tectonic perspective, why are so many towns in harm's way? Well, because it's a river valley. Why is there a river valley? Because the fault's there. So the fault's chewing up the material, making it easily erodible. The water finds that, creates a river valley, and then people come in and say, hey, this is where I want to grow my crops. And we've had civilization here for 10,000 years or more. So you can see lined up are a bunch of towns that happen to be right along the fault, and that's because it's prime agricultural land. Here's an image from the USGS showing the amount of surface fault rupture. And so imaging is around 4 meters on average, and we have observed greater than 8.5 meters, particularly on the northern Sugu fault. So lots of left lateral strike slip displacement. Now this is the opposite of what we see on the San Andreas. San Andreas is right lateral strike slip. This is left lateral strike slip, but that's just an orientation. The displacements in terms of it rupturing through our engineered features up to 4 meters is a large amount of displacement to deal with. This image, what I want you to notice is all the triangles. So this is going to be one of the best instrumented events that we have ever had. Right now, there's several teams that are processing this information, including some of our GEER team members. And we have essentially 280 recordings times 2. So we have lots and lots of strong motion data. We have near fault information with fling step. We have velocity pulses from directivity. We have far field measurements, and we have all the aftershocks, and we have the 2 main events. So one of the major outcomes from this event is going to be how well recorded it is. I wanted to give you a little bit of geography and place names because I'm going to be throwing some names out. So this town of Golbashi, which is north of the epicenter, was one that was particularly hammered by both fault rupture and liquefaction. The namesake of the event is Marash, it's kind of ground zero for a lot of the structural damage. Also, there's fault rupture and liquefaction. Parzacek is just a little bit south of the epicenter from the main event. Up north is Elbistan. Down in the port region is Iskenderun. And then you've probably been seeing lots of reporting from the Antakya region. I'm sorry, the town of Antakya, which is in the Hatay region. And that was where the directivity was particularly strong. This town of Antakya is the historical town, or the ancient historical town of Antioch. And there's a long history of earthquakes and rebuilding. And then finally, Antep was a region that was not hit as hard and was where we based our initial reconnaissance efforts out of. So a little geography so that you're oriented about some of the place names that I'm talking about. So the advanced team, which I'll get to at the end, but it was really 2 individuals from the US and 2 individuals in country. And we partnered with our colleagues at METU, specifically Professor Under Chetan, who is a colleague of mine. We've been working together for 25 years now, and his crew that had already been doing some preliminary reconnaissance. And we hit the ground running. We tried to get in the air, but the airspace was restricted by the military. And so we were on the ground traveling sun up to sundown, trying to put our arms around the problem and figure out where to focus our efforts on. And we covered top to bottom, side to side, and then brought in a second team to do some more detailed investigations. As I mentioned, the motions are going to be really important from this event, and I have pulled up just 2 motions. These are both from the main event. And so this one you can see is near the epicenter, and this one is south of the epicenter where we had more of the directivity effects. And you can see that there was a lot of long period content. So at the 1 second period, 10-story building-ish, we're seeing greater than a G for near the epicenter, and for further south, we're seeing upwards of 2G at the 1 second period. So large spectral accelerations, pretty big demand. The main event, depending on where you were, was actually felt more like 3 sub-events, and that has its own interesting aspect. So main event did a lot of damage. Second punch comes along, and for the buildings that were hanging on, wiped them out. And you've seen images like this, but the structural response is shocking. I mean, there's regions that are just completely devastated. Towns, we're talking about maybe 10, 12 very large towns or cities with building stock loss on the order of 20, 30, 50, 80%. It's just shocking. So on the left here, we have some foundation failure and some soft story response. On the right, minarets in every town for every church, and it was usually a pretty good indicator of the intensity of the strong ground shaking. Unfortunately, the minarets don't follow the same construction techniques, so it's not a perfect litmus test of how strong the shaking was, but when you saw the minarets chopped off, then you knew that there was pretty intense shaking. The picture on the left is Antakya, where about 80% of the building stock is demolished. On the right, you can see the varied response. So there's a pile of rubble, there's a building that's leaning, there's a building with foundation punching, and then there's buildings that did pretty well. This picture on the right is from Golbashi, where not only did the fault rupture through the town, but there was widespread liquefaction and lateral spreading, and there was just varied performance. Everything that you could imagine is there. Structural collapse of varying levels, structural survivability of varying levels. And here is some footage from Antakya. You can see some buildings, some superficial damage. Total collapse in other areas. Buildings that are going to have to be torn down. Brick infill. Modern construction, not so modern construction. It's really hard to stomach some of these images. So, I mean, it's hard for me being there and witnessing that, and, you know, working with my Turkish colleagues and talking to the people there. One of the things that helped a lot, which I do whenever I go on these reconnaissance efforts, is I talk to everyone that I can through translator to try to empathize with them individually, as opposed to trying to deal with the mass empathy of just complete destruction. So we would stop and talk to everyone we had, and, you know, hear their stories and listen to, oh, you know, there was one place we stopped and we talked to the gas station attendant, and he had lost 17 cousins. And then we'd pull over another place and talk to somebody, and, you know, we're in the port town and we're talking to the harbor master, and he's like, yeah, I lost my whole family and my house is demolished, and so I just live here now at the port, at the harbor, and my job is what keeps me going. So, you know, empathizing with people individually helps in terms of dealing with the level of destruction. Okay, so moving on. Surface fault rupture. Every single textbook example of surface fault rupture you could ever think of was here. There was, you know, knife edge rupture, there was horsetails, there was an echelon stepping, there was flower structures. I mean, everything, just textbook. Pull apart basins. Here I'm showing some pull apart and some ponding, and it ruptures through a structure, ruptures through fences. So it gives us really good markers, ruptures through hillsides, cuts off streams, cuts off the heads of the hilltops, through crops, through towns and structures, fault rupture everywhere. It was very dramatic. It was not widely distributed. So if we go normal to the fault, we didn't see a lot of distributed faulting. It was fairly confined to a region. And that's one of the big questions that we're after, is how distributed is that? Because that's pertinent to a lot of engineering design as well. There's the fault, or paleoseismically, we've trenched it in the faults there. What if we're 500 meters? What if we're a kilometer back? What do we have to worry about? For strike slip, in this example, it was fairly contained unless it was doing a step over, an echelon step over. Liquefaction, it was shocking how much liquefaction there was. On the left, this town of Golbashi, I would hire that structural engineer any day, but apparently they just had no geotech, right? That building, you could still open the doors and the windows, but the foundation, they did nothing. On the right, we're at a port facility, and you could see that the liquefaction and all the venting that came out there, and there was a lot of ground deformations associated with that, typical for port facilities. Another port facility where you can see that the boat is docked at a pile-supported wharf, and then everything around it was not pile-supported. On the right, liquefaction and lateral spreading right through the town, right up against some modern buildings. Large lateral spreads at point bar deposits. This is down in the Hatay region near Antakya. The middle photo, you can see some foundation punching, and you can see the tilt to the building. It was upwards of 5 degrees. Large sand boils associated with here, the fault ruptured around the bend of this highway, and then it was along a river, and then the ground liquefied as well. And so that section of the highway blew out significantly. More liquefaction in port facilities. There was gravel boils at this one location. There was another location that we got out, and it was in this crop field, and there was a buried channel that apparently had freshwater snails, and it was a snail shell boil. Never seen that one. And I told the METU graduate students, I said, you can write a paper on this and be the first person to document freshwater snail shell boils coming out of the ground. Literally, the whole boil was made out of these little tiny freshwater snail shells. Some gee whiz stuff. Liquefaction. Adipazari times 10, as Professor Chetan said. He did work on Adipazari in '99, and we would go to towns and we'd see foundation punching, tilting, liquefaction failures all over the place. Adipazari times 10, crazy amounts of liquefaction. And I want to take a moment here. This is one of my soapboxes, is after I got back to Ankara and I was in meetings with their, with one of their agencies, and people started to go off on these nuanced paths about, oh, there was this complexity, and maybe it was like the additives in the concrete, or maybe it's pretty simple. We know how to build so that things don't fall down, right? And so in statistics, we use this confusion matrix where we have false positives and true positives, false negatives. And I kept coming back to me that we could do this. And the irony is using the term confusion. It's not confusing. If you had bad geotech and bad structural, you end up with a pile. Right here, this was in Iskenderun, and there was buildings around it that also experienced liquefaction and survived pretty well. Structurally, this one was not up to snuff, and geotechnically it was not up to snuff. And so bad design kills people. You can have good structural design and you don't do anything about the geotech, and it's complete loss. You could have good geotech. These were really good foundation conditions up in Elbistan, really good mountain firm soils, and you do a bad job on the structural, and again, no good. And then finally, and we know how to do this, if you look at this picture, you can see that there's piles of rubble on either side of this building. This one even has a soft story. You can see that the first story has some open bays and probably doesn't have as much shear resistance as we'd want, and it performed well. right? So good foundation, good structural, we can do this. It's not that complex. And the issues that Turkey's sorting through right now is they have good codes. The codes were firmed up in 99. There's no issues with the codes. It has to do with compliance. It has to do with greed and corruption and graft and human nature and laziness and cutting corners. And it's really disheartening to see so much life loss from poor decisions being made. Okay, moving on. While I was there, one of the tasks that fell to me was to visit embankment dams. The dam agency was responding to damage to some of the dams, and I have a fair amount of experience looking at failed dams from prior reconnaissance efforts. And so I was assigned to look at 5 dams with one of my colleagues there from Turkey, and I'm just going to show a couple of them. This is a big dam. This one's about all of them are about, that I looked at, were about 55 to 60 meters tall. And on the right, you see lots of crest cracking. And on the left, you see face cracking. I've circled this particular structure to indicate that that's the same structure. So the first one, we're standing on the crest. On the right, the left picture, we're down on the face, and you see large face cracks and large deformations. And then we get down to the toe, and we see liquefaction. And so, is this unanticipated? No, I mean, we build dams on rivers. Rivers move sediment. We built most of the dams before we fully understood liquefaction. And we build dams on faults too, because that's where rivers are. And we built most of our dams before we knew where all the faults were. So there wasn't a faulting here, but there was liquefaction, and we saw large crest cracks and large face cracks. Fortunately, what the dam agencies did, one, they were in a drought. 2, the minute that there was reported damage, they drew down any dams. So they pulled them down to the low pool so that there was no risk of subsequent failure. So this one was low pool by the time we got there. That was Sultan Suya Dam, that was up north. Ariklakash Dam, we pulled in, same thing, large crest cracks. This crest expanded at least a couple of meters. I think we measured 2.2 meters of expansion this way, and then grobens dropping down, and then you get down on the face and you see large face cracks, and then you can see the picture on the left is large sand boils. There's my colleague Umut. He was prior to this, he was actually a PhD student of mine that I've been advising at METU, and I told him, now you're the country's foremost seismic dam expert, after we visited 5 dams, and I said, you've got your career set for you. We visited several other dams. These were the most damaged. We saw seismic compression as the failure mechanism for some of them, which may not have to be dealt with other than superficially. And then there was one that had some slope stability issues not associated with liquefaction, which probably could be dealt with easily. These 2 dams with the liquefaction are going to need some more severe reconstruction. This is probably, you've seen images of this. So this one, no one was hurt. And we had a couple hours at the end of one day, and I thought I needed to visit it just to document this and figure out what was going on. So I've got some footage here, drone footage. This is not my drone footage, but you can see very dramatic failure. And there is people conjecturing, oh, the fault ruptured through here. Oh, it's karstic terrain. It's very dramatic. One of the first things that we did is we were talking to the locals, and it turns out that the ancient name of this translates directly to Village of the Big Cracks. So Turkey is great because the towns have these demonstrative names. One of my geologist colleagues says, you don't need a geology map. You just pull in and you ask them what the ancient name of the town is. And it's like, oh, it's the karst town, or it's the town where the building was ruptured, the fault ruptured through the hotel, or it's the town of the dam that sits on claystone or something like that. And this one was the town or the Village of the Big Cracks. So crazy type of response. This happened from the main event. And I wanted to figure out what was going on. This is my picture. You can see the sun was about to set. So I climbed down, got into right by the headscarp, and there was a clay stone at the base. We have beds. You can see the dipping beds here. The beds are dipping at about 8-10 degrees. The slope steepens from about 10 to 20 degrees at the toe. And we were told by several locals that there was heavy rainfall prior to the main event. So a day or 2 days before the main event, we had heavy rainfall, and then you have the earthquake providing. And in this area, we had PGAs at some of the stations on the order of horizontal on the order of a G, vertical also on the order of a G. And so we did, I just did some quick calcs, and the static factor safety is below what we would want to leave it as engineers. And the KY here is pretty low. And so my thinking at this point, we're going to do some subsequent analysis, is that we had a retrogressive failure where at the steepest part, the toe kicked out, and then we had this progressive failure, and we grabbed a bunch of that clay stone. It was fully remolded, and we took it back to the lab, and we're looking at friction angles on the order of 8 to 10 degrees as well. So this one, really dramatic, very interesting, but pretty easy explanation. Okay, so the big lessons from this, and I didn't show a lot of transportation infrastructure pictures, is because it performed brilliantly. In Turkey, man, they're doing such a good job on the roads, on the viaducts, on the bridges, on the tunnels, on the overpasses. Wow. Great. I mean, it performed brilliantly. We saw situations where the fault ruptured through tunnel and the tunnel performed great, and huge viaducts that seismically performed well, and all the highways and the toll roads, great. So that's awesome. There was widespread liquefaction, as I said, on the order of 10 times at Adipazari. There's so much, it's really hard to figure out where to focus next. Fault rupture everywhere, 450 kilometers worth. Right now, we're partnering with Turkish colleagues, and they're flying drones of both faults. And then we're going to do structure for motion on that to try to image the fault displacements as carefully as we can. Something I'd never seen is coincident fault rupture and liquefaction. So you have these two imprinted on top of each other, faults rupturing through towns, stepping over, and then liquefaction and lateral spreading on top of it. A lot of those towns, this fault like to do left stepovers. And when you have left stepovers and a left lateral, you get a pull apart basin. And that's why those lakes are there. And so a lot of these towns had high groundwater, sandy soils, very liquefiable. There was also soft soil failure, cyclic failure that we saw. Strong ground motions are going to be very, very useful for the engineering community as we move forward. We have very little near fault ground motions prior to this, and now we're going to have a lot of near fault ground motions with directivity pulses and velocity, or the fling steps and velocity pulses, and like everything. It's going to be a smorgasbord of ground motion stuff. I mean, I can't really quantify this as an engineer, but most of the deaths are due to man-made disaster. Either poor construction, poor foundation, or just no adherence to building codes. And there's lots of stories that you can read in the press about this right now. And it's a big issue, and it's a really hard one to tackle. Same thing we saw in Nepal in 2015 is they have good building codes, and there's just not enforcement, and the legal system does not close the loop. And then you end up with buildings that squish people. I don't know how to handle that. And then embankment dams, that's going to be a big lesson from this, is the embankment dams and the varied performance. And so there's going to be a lot of good case histories that come out of this. I did not witness any fault rupture through dams, but we did witness varied performance in terms of liquefaction, seismic compression, and seismic slope stability. Since some of you are budding researchers, I wanted to give you an idea of the tools that we use on recon efforts like this. And I encourage you to get involved with GEER. A good way to get engaged if you're a geotech is through GEER. If you're a structural is through EERI, and then participate in the virtual reconnaissance. So while the whole time we're in the field, we had virtual reconnaissance team, and I would message them quickly and say, I need this map, or I need to contact this person, or hey, can you make these connections? And that's vital, is having a very useful virtual team that is providing information while we're there. So the big thing is you can have all the fancy tools you need, but you really just have to use your eyes, and you have to get around, and you have to think, think through the physics. And usually the grad students that are with me will have a tape measure and we'll have inclinometers and stuff, but my pace is a meter and my hand is 10 centimeters, and I measure things quickly that way. And then you have to have a lot of caffeine, and you're usually operating with very little food. Fortunately, we found places to stay, but early on, we all brought sleeping bags because right before we got there, most researchers were sleeping in their cars or sleeping on the ground because there was not viable hotels to stay in. Fortunately, we had my colleague Umut, his cousin, ran a hotel in Antep, and they had closed it, but they opened it for us, and they didn't have the heat on yet, but we were happy to have a place to stay. And then, we could get kebabs at night and then move out at daybreak. Using a GPS-enabled camera and phone, I used an app called Solocator, and it's great because it imprints the GPS and it imprints the aspect ratio right on the photos. I do real-time tracking of my movement. I was using an InReach Mini, and then I can import that as a KML onto Google Earth. So I've got the Google Earth map open, and I've got a hotspot, and I'm tracking where I am with respect to the faults and the towns and whatnot. I'm always making paper notes because I'm worried about running out of batteries, and then I take a snapshot of my paper notes and I embed that with the photos. WhatsApp was indispensable, and those of you that are outside the US, that WhatsApp is fabulous for staying in. So we had our groups within WhatsApp groups, and then we shared locations so that we knew where we were, and we didn't always have to communicate. We say, we'd look and say, they're in Antep right now, or they're up in Elbistan. It was winter there, so we were wearing warm clothes. Always bring a high-vis vest because that can get you into a lot of places if you look official. We took samples of the ejecta or any soil samples that we needed, and we shipped those back to Metu quickly for doing testing. Of course, you need to charge everything and have, connectivity, lots of plugs in the car, charging things all the time. And then, as I mentioned, virtual team members was indispensable for this. So just some thoughts on doing the recon, because I've been doing this for a while now. And then the follow-on, right, is all of our remote sensing. The INSAR images are great, satellite images are great, optical image correlation. We're going to be doing structure for motion from the drones. There's probably going to be some follow-on LiDAR. This stuff is invaluable now. And then you can get a wealth of information talking to people that experienced it. One, you can generate empathy, but two, their lay knowledge often directs you to stuff that's important. You stop and say, hey, they say, yeah, that's important, but go down the road because there's a big crack in the hillside. And then you go there and you're like, oh gosh, this is great. Or they say, go over here and look at this building because it's particularly interesting. So talking to the local people to gather that information. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, and I wanted to throw this out to everybody. As I said, this issue of non-compliance for building codes was something we experienced in Nepal, and students and I started to try to find a way to, how do you get adults to do things when they're traditionally not? And trying to change the system is really hard. And so we thought maybe we can take an educational approach. Maybe we can start educating middle schoolers. And it's like when I was a kid and we were educated about recycling, and now it's just intuitive. It's just rote. Like I can't throw a glass bottle. I mean, there's issues with recycling, right? And so, but I can't throw a glass bottle in the trash because intuitively, that doesn't make sense to me. I find and I'll carry it around and I'll find the recycling and people my parents' age, they just throw everything in the garbage. It's shocking. My neighbors, I love them, but I look in their garbage can when I take the can out to the street and there's just all kinds of recycling in there. And I send my young son out there. I'm like, go sort that stuff and don't make any noise because we don't. Can we do this with shear resistance and foundations, right? Can we educate middle schoolers so that because the adults aren't doing the job, maybe the kids will do the job. And when they get older and they start shopping around and they're like going to rent a place and they say, hey, can I see the as-built? I want to make sure that you have good shear walls in here. And, you know, what kind of foundation do you have? And did you test the soil? One of the things that we found in Turkey is that there's entire companies that'll fabricate the foundation report for you. So people aren't even testing the soils. They don't even know that there's liquefiable material down there. Can we design an app or a game that's really fun and rewards people for saving, you know, lives? They could be little characters, but you put in enough shear resistance and you put in the right foundation and you move away from the fault, and then the event happens and then you get rewards for doing that. Is that something that we can do? I want to throw this out there because we need to solve this problem for parts of the world where enforcement, building code enforcement is the issue. So I'm open to any and all ideas. It's something that I think is worthwhile and that the engineering community needs to focus on is workarounds for places that don't enforce building codes. Okay, I'm going to close up here. This is the advanced team. There's on the left is my colleague Ander and I. And like I said, we've been working together since our days at Berkeley back in the early aughts, doing our PhDs together. It was wonderful to go and support him. When this event happened, I always ask my wife first. I said, what do you think? She says, yeah, you got to go on this one. And then, you know, all I was thinking about was Ander. There he is. And he was managing this whole thing himself. And so I was happy to provide support. On the lower right is the advanced team. So on the diagonals is me and Oz. Oz is coming from the US and is a fault geologist, paleoseismologist. And then the other diagonals on the right is Umut, who's a PhD student there and joined me for the 6 days in the field. And then Erhan is a professor there in Turkey and was with Oz the whole time. So this was the advanced team. And while we were out in the field in the latter half, you can see Ander was on national news. This was a 3-hour program trying to sort through the issues. I applaud him. I don't like to do media stuff like this. This was a circus, but he did a great job. And then here's Team A. So this was the subsequent team that we sent. Colleagues from Georgia Tech and Southwest Research Institute and other, we sent 5 or 6 from the US, and they partnered with 5 or 6 in Turkey to try to drill down on subsequent topics. This is most of the team. I don't think Genghis is in that picture. And then to end with, here is Oz has, I'm not a big Apple phone person, but Oz has one of the new iPhones that has LiDAR. And so this is a sand boil floating in space that he LiDAR'd with his phone, which I thought was, which is a nice way to end a talk like this. So maybe I might have to get a new iPhone if it's got LiDAR. With I mean, come on, LiDAR on your phone? How cool is that? Okay, so that's my last slide, and I'm looking forward to some really good questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor, for such a wonderful presentation. Like, it was really insightful, and I hope it motivates the next generation of engineers to come up with better solutions for disaster mitigation. We have a few questions in the chat box. Let's go through them, and then we can open questions for everybody. Also, I would request everybody to stay, especially the students, to stay till the end of seminar, because there's a chance you might win an Uber voucher.
Uber Eats, calling out Uber
voucher.
Eats.
Yeah. All right, so let's see. The first question is, what what date was the footage that you showed in the initial few slides?
What was the question? Sorry.
What was the date of the footage, like the video footage that you showed in the initial few slides?
If you're talking about the footage from Antakya, that
Yeah.
was probably on the probably close to the end of last month. So that image was shot by Kevin Klahan as they were traveling to the southern region. And I think maybe the question is pertaining to how quickly are they recovering and how do they get rid of all the destruction and the debris. Right now, the contractors are not getting, the government said no pay for removing the material. And so it's recovering aggregate and steel on their own in order to then recycle that material. And so all the contractors that are available were tasked with go in and remove debris as fast as possible. This is post-recovery. So this is not the rescue operations trying to get people out. This is now it's just rubble. Let's get the rubble out of the way.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. The next question is from Arsam Taslimi. What are the possibilities of seeing the same rupture mechanism in California, as here there are a lot of active faults close to each other?
Yeah, I mean, this would be a really good analog for rupture on the San Andreas. You know, here I'm in San Luis Obispo, and the Fort Tejon event, which is 1856, is the, you know, the big scary one down here. And it would look very similar to that in terms of the fault rupture, the ground shaking, how the motions propagate out. If it ruptures in a preferential manner, the directivity effects, all of that. So in terms of what we're seeing here and what we could see in California, yes. In terms of the structural damage, no. We enforce our building codes, and we have lots of situations where we've experienced earthquakes and we see how good the performance is. The same thing that we saw in Chile in 2010 and Tohoku in 2011 and Christchurch. If you enforce building codes, you're going to have some damage, but in terms of loss of life, order of magnitude less loss of life when you're in a country that has good building codes and enforces the building codes.
Next question by Christian is if you have any comments on the seismic behavior of retaining structures. Also, were there any tall buildings, say over 30 to 40 stories, affected by these earthquakes?
I would direct you, for the tall buildings, I would direct you to my colleagues at ERI, and we're giving a joint talk on Monday, and they can talk about that. But from retaining structures, yes, we saw lots of retaining structures, and as we've seen in the past, retaining structures do really well. We saw some retaining structures that were ruptured by faults and inflicted strong ground shaking and were damaged, but still did pretty well. You know, the concept of retaining structures that we over-design, yes. And can we continue to over-design them that way? I think that's fine. They do well in earthquakes, and using a Mononobe Okabe type approach is a significant over-design.
Patrick from Ohio State says that great talk and love the educational app idea. Also, Patrick asks, are there near future plans to perform detailed geotech site investigations, CPTs, borings, etc., at liquefaction sites?
Yeah. Hey, Patrick. And yes, what we're focusing on next is we're doing cost sharing with various researchers in Turkey, and we're trying to come up with some subsurface investigations so that we can do detailed mapping of cities like Iskenderun and Gulbashi and others where we saw varied foundation performance. We'll get the subsurface information, and then we can map that to coming up with predictive models, similar to the approach used in Adapazari.
Okay. There's another question. If I was wondering if anything related to site response that caught your attention.
Well, we definitely saw much stronger ground shaking south in the Hatay region, which corresponds with that bidirectional rupture, and it heading from Parzachek down to Antakya. And right now, the ground motions are still being processed, getting close. There's been some preliminary processing, but getting close in terms of, yes, these are the motions we can rely on, and then we'll have a really good sense of site response effects and directivity effects and near fault effects and all that juicy stuff. But yes, we saw intense ground shaking in the direction of the rupture propagation.
The next question, actually, I also had similar kind of question. Like, was there any survey of underground utilities like water supplies, sewers, and how they performed?
Yep, there was fault rupture through water mains, gas mains, underneath power infrastructure. And there's a subsequent team that is headed back right now, LFE team, who are documenting that carefully. One of the tricky issues was that a lot of the agencies are not very comfortable just letting people in. And so there needed to be careful negotiations to allow researchers to come in and document this. And so there's going to be more information coming out, but there were some lifelines crossings with the fault, and there's going to be data coming out on that.
So another question on embankment dams by Daniel. The embankment dams appeared to perform relatively well with no collapse. In your opinion, how much of that is attributed to quick operational decisions versus dam geometry or like foundational conditions?
Yeah, great question. The embankment dams, as we know, are very ductile. And so even though for the ones that we saw large deformations, they would probably still maintain most of the pool. That's hard to say. And then operationally, the dam agency's response to do immediate drawdown was great. One of the benefits, one of the good outcomes from this is that every dam that we visited, there was no damage to the outlet structures. So that would be a big issue, is if you have damage to the dam and then you have damage to the outlet structure and you can't release the water. Like Oroville was not seismic induced, but that was an issue where we needed to release water and we couldn't because the outlet structures were damaged. So here we examined all the outlet structures and the inlet structures, and there was no seismic damage to those, and they performed as they needed to. So that is a good takeaway from this. Embankment dams deformed, did well, reasonably well. Outlet structures performed great. They could release the water, go back, rebuild how they need to, and then back in business. There's going to be a lot of useful case histories on embankment dams coming out of this earthquake. So there's going to be a couple years of work on that.
Yeah. The next question is about these steel structures and how did they perform? I guess this is something related to the tall buildings, which
Monday, show up Monday. Yeah, look at the preliminary EERI report and then show up on Monday, and they're going to be talking about different structural categories and how they respond.
Right. There's another question about what's the future of research in the affected territory? Like how should people what kind of research, what direction of research should people undertake, or academicians and other industrial folks, what direction should they adopt?
That's the $100,000 question, right? So there's various teams that are mobilizing right now to capitalize on this and learn from this event. I know that as GEER, we are intending to submit a rapid proposal, and we're after primarily some fault-related stuff, and then some characterization of the subsurface conditions related to both the strong motion stations as well as foundation performance. So that's what we're focusing on in the immediate future. But this is a big event. There's lots of information that's coming out, and there's lots of avenues to follow up on this.
There's another last question. Professor, we can take ground motions, displacements, settlements, but how do we solve for fault rupture and rifts?
Well, I think you mean in terms of timing. We can't do timing, but we can do location and we can do magnitude pretty well. If you have been following the literature on this, there was 2 studies that were on the order of 10 and 20 years ago that had forecast that this region was ripe. Turkey, the faults in Turkey tend to rupture in sequences, and it's similar to Chile. In Chile, they tend to rupture in sequences, and you can see where a gap is. And then you do paleoseismic studies and you say, oh yeah, well, this one hasn't gone off in 800 years, whereas the next segment went off 100 years ago, so it's likely. So timing, no, but location and size, yeah. I think one of the shockers here was that we had two events. We had the 7.8, which had a little small fault that triggered it. And then we had the 7.5, which was two separate faults that were in the Coulomb stress region, and they went together. And so the segmenting, like connecting segments and then the sequencing, is really important for how we do the forecasting. And it's one that we kick around in California all the time is, are these segments going to connect? And is this one going to trigger that one? And so this has to be part of our forecasting model. Is in one of the logic tree branches, we have to weight it that we could have some type of compounded double fault event. It's less unusual than we used to think. Speaking for myself, of course. Great questions.
Yeah. Any other questions in the audience? You can just unmute yourself and ask at this point. Yeah. Oh, there's another question by Burak. Do you think the reconstruction of the buildings is dangerous during aftershock continues? Like,
yeah, aftershocks, you know, aftershocks often are the most demoralizing. They continue on an exponential curve. And what it does to the psyche of people that have, you know, I survived the 7.8. My family didn't, but I survived the 7.8. And now I'm continually being exposed to these aftershocks. So from that perspective, it's really hard for people to get back to moving forward. From a rehabilitation perspective, yes. I mean, if you're trying to do some type of rehabilitation of maybe a yellow tech building, it's going to be dicey to try to get in there. So it may be a total wash if you continue to have aftershocks that are going to load the building, or at least feel like it's loading the building. Yeah.
Any other questions in the audience? Well, till you think of the question, I have another question. Like, you mentioned that the infrastructure performed really well. Like, is there a difference in the time when these infrastructures that performed well were constructed and the buildings that collapsed, like were they constructed before the codal revision of 1990 in Turkey?
You know, one of my colleagues who I think is here, Paul Valadeo, his thoughts were that because a lot of this transportation infrastructure was probably borrowing money from large international organization like World Bank, or maybe the loans were underwritten by World Bank, that there was some oversight there, and that oversight functions really well. So there, for whatever reason, and I think it would be really good to dig into that, is the DOT there, top notch. What is that mechanism? How does that work? How are they doing QA/QC on the design and the construction of these transportation projects versus why residential construction of 5 to 10 story apartment complexes doesn't have that follow through? I mean, that's a whole realm that people could dig into.
Yeah, I think that's where the policy and all the politics just kick in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take a couple of more questions and then we'll end this. So there's another question. What do you think on PGV being a good predictor than PGA?
In terms of structural response?
Yep. I guess so. Like, Ramya, if
yeah,
might
I
want
don't
to.
have any expertise on that. I think my structural colleagues would say PGV is a good indicator for certain size structures, right? So certain mid-rise structures, you're going to shoot for PGV. But I'm going to punt on that because that's not my area expertise.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so I guess thank you so much Oh,
Well,
yeah.
maybe I can ask a question. Hello, Professor Moss. This
Hey.
is Mertcan Gain. I'm originally from Turkey as well. What I wanted to ask is, like, do you believe good quality foundation damage and loss data will be accessible and available for researchers like us for the development of fragility or vulnerability functions? Because the reason why I'm asking you this is if the codes were not followed properly, I believe what we are going to end up with is like the data is going to show the building is very nicely constructed on paper, but
Right.
then in the end we'll see that all of them are collapsed, like and the foundation damages like also very high. So how do you think that we can overcome this issue? Because there is a good amount of data that can be gathered from Turkey and from these two main events. How do you think we can overcome this issue?
So I understand the question and how it pertains to the way things are or have worked there. And yes, I mean, the goal of our cost sharing for doing the subsurface is so that we can go and we can ground truth it. We're not going to rely on the as-builts and the foundation reports for the structures in the regions that we're investigating. We're actually going to poke the soil and get some information, some CPT and some SPT, and say, these are the actual conditions. And then we correlate it to foundation performance and correlate to structural damage so that we have the truth, right? So that's going to take a lot of work. And this type of data collection is very costly and time consuming. So we're looking at, a couple years worth of effort to try to pull this together, similar to Adipazari 99. It took several years of concerted effort to extract the lessons from that. So in terms of that very detailed subsurface investigation and correlation, it's going to take a couple years to extract that information. It's just not readily available, but it's going to be publicly available, right? We're all scientists and we're all going to be sharing. Thanks for a great question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. I think I'll respect everybody's time here because we have gone past 1 p.m. If you have it, like Professor, would it be fine if people contacted you if they have further questions?
Of course, yeah. rmoss@calpoly.edu.
Perfect. So now time for the lucky winners. I'll just share my screen. And if your name is up on the screen and you are in the audience, just shout out yes, or like just show me a thumbs up, or just send a yes in the chat box and we'll send you your coupons.
There's a winner.
Okay. There's a winner. Yeah. Congratulations, Denny. Burak, Elliot, Yongdai, Heba, Jatin, Mariam.
Oh, Elliot. Elliot won. He's on our virtual team. Yay, Elliot. I hope he's in the audience.
All right. So, yeah. And yes, we'll upload the recording on our YouTube channel and post the link on LinkedIn. So be on a lookout for that. All right. Thank you everyone for attending. Hope you all learned something out of this wonderful and insightful presentation by Professor Moss. Thank you, Professor Moss, for agreeing to give this presentation.
Thanks for having me. And I encourage everyone, moving forward, do everything we can. That's our goal, right? As earthquake engineers, is to try to make things better. And that's what we're after, is learn from this and do it better next time. So thanks for your time.
Thank you.